Lucia carefully took out the minerals from her bag, preparing to practice her abilities. Curiosity got the better of Ling, and she peeked her head out from the bed and interrupted Lucia. With a trembling hand, Lucia dropped the bag onto the floor. She turned around and lightly tapped her sister's head, urging her not to disturb and to focus on reading. Pouting, Ling complained that she didn't understand most of the words in the books. Lucia told her that's why she needed to read more, as literacy itself is a process that requires understanding and familiarity. The door creaked open suddenly, and Nightingale walked in. Ling happily ran over upon seeing Nightingale, while Lucia let out a sigh and collected all the metallic debris from the floor into her pouch. She realized that she might not be able to practice this afternoon. A strawberry-scented ice cream was handed to her by Nightingale. Nightingale proudly patted her chest, revealing that it was a reward she specifically requested from the prince. She also handed the ice cream to Ling. When Lucia found out that she only scored 68 points, she felt a bit down. Out of a total of 120 points, she had only answered a little over half correctly. Seeing Lucia's expression, Nightingale comforted her, saying that Lucia had only recently arrived to the border town and her scores already very impressive and that she could always ask her if she didn't understand something. Ling raised both hands and said she wanted to join too, mentioning her desire to work. Nightingale smiled and replied, "The minimum age to start working in the border town is 16 years old and above. Since Ling is only 10 years old, she can't work yet." Ling expressed her aspiration to work in a chemistry laboratory in the future and become a great alchemist. Nightingale shook her head and advised against Ling working in a laboratory, as it was too dangerous. She mentioned that the prince had warned that explosions could happen at any time. Nightingale recounted the incident involving Kyle's accident, which sent shivers down the sisters' spines. Lucia hugged Ling tightly, making up her mind that she would never let her sister work in such a terrifying place. Nightingale suggested that Ling consider working in the city hall. The term civil servant was also coined by the prince. Suddenly, Ling broke free from Lucia's arms and curiously asked, "Sister Nightingale, do you like the prince?" Ling recalled that her mother said if a name is mentioned by a girl many times, it means that person is very important to that girl. Lucia's face stiffened at her sister's question. Goodness, how could she ask such a thing directly? It was incredibly impolite. In a panic, Lucia hurriedly covered Ling's mouth, intended to apologize. However, she was taken aback when Nightingale candidly replied, "Yes, I like the prince." Lucia brought the minerals to meet the prince, still echoing Nightingale's words in her ears. She couldn't help but be amazed by Nightingale's open attitude. It seemed impossible for a witch and a prince to be together. The lord of the border town appeared just as usual, with a slightly sleepy look, indicating that he had recently awakened from a nap. Leaning back in his chair, he seemed relaxed, his tone amiable, completely unlike other nobles who were usually stern. The prince frowned and carefully examined the minerals in his palm, one by one. He didn't recognize these minerals and planned to have Kyle identify them. He instructed Lucia to continue practicing her abilities in the backyard. However, just as Lucia was about to leave, Roland called her back. He praised Lucia for her performance on the test and expressed his hope that Ling would also participate with everyone next time. Lucia excitedly responded and bowed before leaving. As Roland watched the little girl depart with joy, he sighed while looking at the metallic particles on the table. He had been too naive, thinking that he could use Lucia's abilities to uncover the hidden mineral in the northern slope mine. However, reality made him realize the vast gap between mechanical engineering and geology. In terms of color and shape, they were nearly indistinguishable. For example, metals like iron, aluminum, magnesium, and potassium appeared as silver-white metals in their high-purity state, making it extremely difficult to discern them with the naked eye. It seemed he would have to rely on Kyle to solve this problem. Just then, a guard pushed the door open and walked in, carrying a confidential letter from the capital city. Roland set aside his quill and opened the envelope. The letter had no signature, and the handwriting was unfamiliar, but a single sentence indicated that it was undoubtedly from Tassa. It stated that a force of approximately 1,000 people had left the capital today and was heading towards the western frontier. At the Changji Stronghold Theater, as the audience's continuous whistles and applause echoed, the curtain slowly descended. May wiped the sweat off her forehead and looked at Eileen, who was filled with excitement. May nodded slightly in response. As soon as the curtain fell, Eileen couldn't help but rush forward and tightly hugged May. Her acting had received May's approval. May believed that the other young girl's acting was not up to par: stiff expressions, slow movements, lacking emotions. She pointed out all the mistakes, making the little girl teary-eyed. A backstage crew member chuckled and remarked that May was indeed strict. May shook her head, noting that most of the audience today were commoners. If they were nobles, they would nitpick endlessly. Suddenly, a group of people surrounded them. These people were all actors from the theater, and May recognized the leading woman. Bella sneered, calling May and the group all inept actors from the countryside, continuing to mock and taunt them. Her words prompted laughter from the crowd behind her. Eileen retorted, mentioning the enthusiastic cheers from the audience. Bella, with disdain, mocked, referring the audience as people who deals with mud and shovels every day cannot be called an audience. She then said even if few monkeys get up on the stage to walk around, they would still cheer loudly. If it weren't for the free tickets, no one would have watched their crap show. Bella raised her voice, stating that their theater's income had significantly decreased because of accommodating the group's performances. After all, the nobles refused to attend since nobody wanted to sit on chairs filled with mud and grease stains. Bella's intentions were clear. Her seemingly scolding Eileen and the others were actually directed at May herself. May turned around casually and said, "The decrease in theater income is not solely due to free admission. The theater management has undoubtedly reached an agreement with His Royal Highness and Lord Petrov. The necessary funds will naturally be supplemented by the border town municipal hall. This is a business contract, not child's play." She find it ironic that Bella is a brainless shrew who only knows how to shout and scream. Furthermore, the witch's diary was written by His Royal Highness himself. Does Bella want to imply that His Highness's thoughts are low and vulgar? Insulting the royal aristocracy can result in severe punishment, such as the punishment of losing one's voice. Bella gritted her teeth and said, May went to the border town, not to see Eileen, but for Ferlin. Her voice abruptly stopped as a bright red palm mark appeared on her left cheek. Bella couldn't believe it as she touched her face. May took a deep breath. She had acted on impulse. Two male actors behind Bella stepped forward, condemning May's actions while slowly approaching her. May smirked inwardly. Yes, she had acted impulsively, but she saw no reason to apologize. She glared at the two men. She couldn't help but recall what Carter had once said. While men may possess greater strength, they also have many weaknesses. Certain attacks can instantly render them defenseless. Although she wasn't quite sure how the conversation had led to this, she was prepared to strike if these two men came any closer. Just then, the door to the dressing room was violently pushed open, and a knight in armor walked in. Several armed warriors with spears followed closely behind him. As they entered the room, they aimed their spears at the crowd. May couldn't help but freeze, blinking her eyes, thinking that what she was witnessing was an illusion. However, nothing changed. She even saw a smile sneakily appear on the knight's face. The knight was none other than Carter. The conflict quickly came to an end. Upon seeing the intimidating knight, no one dared to say another word. In the evening, when they returned to May's residence, she poured a glass of wine for Carter. Carter was surprised to see that the home of the most popular actor in the western region was so ordinary. May explained that she had used all her savings to purchase this small, old house located in a deep alley of the inner city. Although the house was small and worn out, moving away from the outer city would at least protect her from harassment and prying eyes of ill intentions. Carter awkwardly apologized, but May smiled and reassured him that it was fine. She poured herself a small glass of wine and asked Carter if he had come to sort out the theater's order and resolve the disputes among the actors. Carter shook his head and replied that it was Timothy causing trouble again, and the main forces were on their way. He had come ahead to make preparations and also really wanted to see May's performance. May froze for a moment, then shook her head. These things shouldn't have been told to her. Carter said he knew where to draw the line, and it wasn't a covert operation either. May promptly took the glass of wine from Carter's hand, saying that he shouldn't drink during mission. However, after everything settles down, she would gladly invite him for a proper drink. As for Carter's previous invitation, she already had an answer in her heart. Some things can only be known after trying. Border town is where she truly wanted to stay. She had decided to move to the border town with her father after the performance is over. Roland arrived at the Changu stronghold 2 days later. Petrovan members of the 5 major families greeted the prince. Roland stated that the exact number and route of Timothy's forces were still unknown, but they were undoubtedly targeting the western frontier. Based on Timothy's usual tactics, they would likely recruit civilians through pillaging and then use drugs to force them into attacking. One of the family members was unclear about the drugs mentioned, so Roland explained that they were evil pills that could grant civilians powers stronger than knights, but once the effect wore off, the users would die in helpless agony. Roland ordered them to bring all their family members and the local civilians into the stronghold. One of the family members mentioned their warehouse with food and goods, but Roland firmly interrupted, saying they had only 3 days to transport as much as they could, but it was essential to gather all the civilians within the stronghold. He cannot allow Timothy and his troops to harm the civilians. After the meeting, the prince summoned Axe into the castle. Roland did not reveal the true information he possessed to the nobles. Thanks to Lightning and Macy's meticulous reconnaissance, the team from the capital city had been exposed. Unlike the previous invaders, they were now sailing on a single-masted ship, following the main channel of the Crimson Water River, heading west into the center of the western region. This was a particularly tricky route. Once the enemy crossed the fork in the river, they could either turn back along the tributary to attack the southern and eastern gates of the Changji stronghold or continue westward, straight to the border town. To avoid the dilemma of dividing forces for defense, Roland had to proactively concentrate his superior forces to defeat the enemy in one decisive blow. Clearly, the fork in the Crimson Water River was the most suitable ambush location. Roland left 100 soldiers to guard the Changji stronghold while he himself would join the front lines after organizing the stronghold's defenses. Nightingale felt uneasy, but Roland reassured her that he had to go. He needed to utilize the abilities of the witches. A white-tailed kite glided through the sky before landing gracefully on Roland's shoulder. Roland summoned the witches and began discussing the creation of bunkers and tanks. The concept of bunkers was already familiar to them, but they had never heard of tanks before. Roland sketched a simple design, explaining that it was a carriage with a cannon mounted on it. However, he mentioned that they couldn't truly call it a tank yet, as they didn't have enough horses. Nevertheless, Honey could gather wild beasts to assist them. Nanawa asked if beasts pulling cannons could be considered tanks, to which Roland replied earnestly, "Of course. They can call them tiger style and leopard style." Next, Roland shared his plan with Lien. He intended to establish defensive lines on both sides of the main river channel. He used sticks to create a rough diagram, but Lien didn't fully understand. While it would allow the soldiers to hide effectively, she doubted it would prevent Timothy's fleet from passing through. Roland didn't offer much explanation, simply stating that there's no way for them to be able to get through. Then he turned to Leaf and tasked her with concealing the fortifications. He instructed her to use weeds and vines, making the bunkers appear more natural and blend in with the surroundings. Leaf assured Lien that they should trust the prince. In Roland's mind, he imagined how, once the cannons were pushed into the well-disguised fortifications, each compartment would fire rounds after rounds. The 16 field cannons would maintain their accuracy despite the rough terrain. In fact, at such a close range, they could hit the sailing ships in the middle of the river even with their eyes closed. the enemy would find themselves in a disadvantageous formation. The enemy fleet arrived at the fork in the Crimson Water River half a day later than anticipated. Upon receiving the news, Vaynor gave the preparedness order to the artillery crews and then returned to his own position. Each compartment had a shooting window and a hole near the top of the wall. Climbing 2 steps of the earthen tower allowed for a convenient view of the situation on the river. The soldiers chatted and laughed, happily wiping the cannonballs. Vaynor sighed inwardly. These guys had lost their sense of tension. They no longer trembled like they did on the battlefield several months ago. He couldn't say whether this change was good or bad, as he felt they were underestimating their opponents. However, he couldn't harshly reprimand his subordinates either, because he himself wasn't any better. Since becoming soldiers under the prince, their understanding of combat had undergone a dramatic transformation. Bloody and brutal fighting seemed unrelated to strength, skill, or bravery. They simply repeated the memorized steps from their training, prepare and fire towards the enemy according to training to achieve victory. Alongside the assistance of the witches, they hadn't lost a single battle. One soldier even thought that it would be great if he got injured so he could see the angel Manhwa. Vaynor punched him on the head, telling him to pay attention to the enemy situation. Just as Vaynor was lost in his thoughts, the warning from the scouts brought him back. The soldiers changed their expressions and started loading ammunition seriously, waiting for orders. The compartments became bustling with activity. They had practiced this step too many times. They silently awaited the arrival of the attack signal flag. The fleet, now visible in the distance, was getting closer and closer to their ambush location. However, Prince Roland had still not given any orders. Sylvie and Lien grew increasingly anxious, fearing that they might not have time for the messengers to relay their commands. It was almost too late to stop the fleet from passing through the fork in the Crimson Water River. Roland instructed the 2 witches to listen, and suddenly, a deafening roar reverberated across the river. As if it were a signal to attack, thick smoke mixed with flames erupted from over a dozen bunkers, accompanied by the continuous rumbling of thunderous explosions. Lien redirected her gaze back to the river, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. There were no knights or mercenaries engaged in close combat, yet the deck of the first sailing ship seemed to explode. Wood splinters and body parts scattered in all directions, and the crew on the ship were instantly killed or injured, with blood mist rising and staining the deck. She can only see a black sphere being shot out from the bunkers, which she thought was useless, swaying for a moment before crashing down with a thunderous impact, knocking 2 knights who had just climbed from the cabin to the deck. Sylvie finally understood what the prince meant by "they won't make it through." However, how did his subordinates manage to achieve this? Compared to Lien, who was observing from a distance, Sylvie had a more vivid view of the scene. It was the first time she had witnessed such a sight. No sharp blades or spears were needed. With just round, rolling spheres, people were torn apart. As her vision was too close, she even felt that the blood and entrails of those killed were splashing onto her own body. Several others were struck by the iron spheres, either severing limbs or shattering their skulls. The ship's cabin was now filled with flowing fluids and a mix of red and white. Suddenly, the witch felt a surge of nausea and started puking. Prince Roland noticed her discomfort and handed her a handkerchief, advising her not to use her abilities to watch any further. Sylvie took the handkerchief and wiped her mouth. This was probably the incredible invention that Maisie and Lightning had mentioned, but at that time, no one paid much attention or thought much of it. After all, it was hard to imagine such an astonishing weapon without witnessing it firsthand. She turned her gaze back to the battlefield and saw the Timothy fleet beginning to approach the banks. However, they were unaware that Prince Roland had set up fortifications in more than just one location. But the soldiers inside the bunkers did not give them a chance. The soldiers just aimed their weapons at the targets and easily pulled the trigger. The enemy couldn't hold on for long before collapsing completely. Those who had disembarked from the ships tried to get back on board, while those waiting to disembark scrambled in all directions. The prince put down his binoculars and ordered Axe to take the reserve troops to clear the battlefield. He wanted the leader to be captured. Roland asks Sylvie to follow Axe, as he doesn't want anyone escaping. With a nod, Sylvie agreed to accompany Axe. She suddenly understood why Prince Roland dared to openly protect the witches in this corner of the continent. With such formidable power at his disposal, even Church's Divine Punishment Army would not easily defeat him. Axe arrived with 2 prisoners. Before Roland could even inquire, one of them began shouting loudly, claiming to be a Bark Knight and requesting permission to write a letter to his family. He assured them that his family would undoubtedly offer a generous ransom. The other person introduced himself as a nobleman's second son and expressed willingness to pay a ransom as well. Roland raised an eyebrow in response. He asked if these 2 were the ones who led the attack. Both of them were frightened and hastily pointed out Sir Vincent was the leader, but he had perished during the first wave of the attack. They also requested to have their ropes removed, hoping to receive proper treatment. The prince shook his head and stated that no ransom was necessary. However, if they were willing to reveal Timothy's plan and any information they possessed, he might consider granting them better treatment. The 2 individuals hesitated for a moment but declined the offer, explaining that they had sworn allegiance to Timothy and could not betray their oath. Roland shrugged indifferently and ordered his guards to take them away and hand them over to Axe. Roland turned around and told Axe that he had no restrictions on the methods or means to obtain sufficient intelligence. He made it clear that he would show no mercy towards those who had captured and harmed innocent civilians and dared to invade the Western territory. Roland's tone grew cold. Once you're done questioning them, treat them as deceased. After a few days, Roland returned to the border town. Axe also brought all the information obtained from the interrogation. Roland furrowed his brows. This was just the vanguard force. The information Axe obtained revealed that Timothy dispatched one militia force after another to attack the western borders. He employed the same method to deal with Garcia in Greenwater Port. These forces consisted of criminals, rats, and mostly refugees gathered from various places. The intelligence from the enemy knights revealed that Timothy deceived these people, initially using verbal promises to appease them before having them ingest the first batch of pills. Consequently, they were then under the control of Timothy, as they sought more pills to alleviate their pain and cravings. This attack is merely meant to deplete the border town's resources. The fallen knight Sir Vincent believed that since the town had no walls, he estimated that around 1,000 militiamen who consumed the pills would result in approximately 3,000 casualties. This would be a severe blow to the border town. Meanwhile, he could observe Roland's response and the effectiveness of his tactics. Roland couldn't help but feel a burning hatred and frustration. Timothy was using wave after wave of cannon fodder. Even if Roland managed to emerge victorious without a scratch, it would still be a Pyrrhic victory. Compared to repelling Timothy's invasion, his primary concern was putting an end to this meaningless war. Otherwise, how long would it take for the population to flourish again once Grey Castle was unified? Roland knew that the month of the demons was approaching, and soon the entire western border would be covered in heavy snow, making it impossible for land travel. Timothy undoubtedly intended to act before the winter snow arrived. Roland closed his eyes, pondered for a moment, and continued, expressing his desire to stall this war. Sending envoys or diplomatic communications would be ineffective. Roland was determined to prevent Timothy from seizing the population. He planned to evacuate the people before Timothy could reach them. Additionally, he aimed to instill fear in Timothy regarding the western borders. For instance, allowing some prisoners to escape back to the capital city, spreading fear in the capital city. Despite the risk of exposing their tactics and weapons. However, since there's no way of them obtaining the manufacturing method, Roland wasn't concerned. Lastly, Roland intended to write a warning letter, foretelling the day of the attack in advance, and then launch an assault on the exact day. Roland had decided to attack from the sky. He was no longer the weak and insignificant newcomer who needed to hide himself under disguise. It was time to reveal his true power, step by step, and take Timothy's place on the political stage of Grey Castle. He wanted the kingdom's people to take notice of his presence. It had nothing to do with vanity but rather a form of promotion for his territory and influence. A kingdom filled with corpses and ruins would be of no use to him. Through this demonstration, he hoped to encourage more people to venture to the western borders and stand by his side. As promised, the Margaret Trading Company arrived at the border town. While enjoying a delicious feast, they discussed Garcia's black sail fleet. It was said that after plundering several cities, they sailed north along the coastline, and nobody knew where they had gone. Margaret inquired about the hot air balloon, so Roland led them to the backyard and taught them how to operate it, demonstrating its safety. Once inflated, the balloon remained unaffected by rain, impacts, fire, or even the pecking of birds. Margaret quickly grasped the key points and asked how many gas canisters were needed. Roland replied that it required around 5 or 6 canisters for a single hot air balloon. Margaret thought such alchemical technology would be quite expensive. Roland cleared his throat and employed excellent sales tactics, offering the first inflation of the balloon for free and even including a complimentary camouflage outfit. After the caravan departed, Roland let out a long sigh of relief. The treasury was once again filled, and he could finally begin expanding the population. He looked up at the sky, envisioning the construction of the city next year. The banks of the Crimson Water River would undoubtedly be dotted with residential houses. Roland decided to go and visit Anna in the backyard on the northern slope. Upon entering, the first thing that caught his eye was the floor covered in metal blocks. Roland was astonished to see that they had already reached over 2,000 in number. Anna mentioned that block 1057 was particularly sturdy, while 2284 excelled in both hardness and toughness. Lucia held a small notebook and reported that block 2284 contained 0.8% carbon and 15.2% unknown elements. The test conducted by Anna and Lucia were of great significance. Roland instructed Lucia to break down the ores into various raw materials, and then Anna would blend them with pure iron in different mass ratios, melt them together, and create test blocks to assess their performance. Although Roland knew that steel was essentially an iron-carbon alloy, with higher carbon content resulting in pig iron and no carbon resulting in pure iron, he was aware that carbon content within a specific range could be classified as steel. Furthermore, even the slightest fluctuation in carbon content could significantly alter the properties of the metal. Therefore, the first thing to be determined was the extent of this range. After a few encouraging words to the two witches, Roland sat back and quietly watched the two girls working. Although the autumn sun still shone brightly, it no longer carried the scorching heat of the summer. He felt a warm sensation throughout his body, accompanied by a long-lost sense of tranquility. He lost track of time as the courtyard gradually grew quiet. Suddenly, he felt a soft hand resting on his forehead. Lucia was nowhere in sight, but Anna stood before him. Roland was startled, and Anna warned him, saying, "Your Highness, be careful not to catch a cold." Anna looked into Roland's eyes and knew that he had something to tell her. Roland hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly shook his head. He held Anna's hand, feeling somewhat perplexed, and roughly explained the plan to expand the population. He mentioned the initial freedom of choice, but now, to save time, he had resorted to some half-enticing, half-coercive methods. Although he did this to prevent the civilians from being forcefully conscripted by Timothy and ultimately succumbing to the ravages of the pills, upon reflection, Roland realized that his actions were not so different from Timothy's. The only distinction lay in their respective goals. Anna covered the prince's mouth, understanding that Roland was concerned that others might not appreciate his actions, and he himself couldn't guarantee that all of his future goals were correct. Roland was unsure whether the means or the desired outcomes were more important. Before he could respond, Anna had already moved closer, holding his hands and whispered softly in his ear, assuring him that she would watch over him carefully. The environment on Slumbering Isle was improving day by day. Once airborne, Tilly could see the bustling crowds and lively markets below. It was no longer the secluded place where only around 300 witches resided in isolation. Through negotiations and agreements, they had established commercial connections with the surrounding islands. Tilly had even brought in a group of ordinary residents from some overcrowded village islands. Although they currently lived on the outskirts of the island, far from the witches, Tilly believed that one day Slumbering Isle would become a city where everyone would live together harmoniously. Tilly could temporarily fly using magic stones, but she hadn't figured out the underlying principles yet. Just as she was conversing with Ashes, a massive white bird descended from the sky. Due to its rapid descent, it crashed onto the ground, raising a cloud of dust. It was Maisie, who couldn't believe that Tilly was actually flying in the sky. Tilly playfully rubbed her cheek and asked Maisie how the witches from Slumbering Isle were doing in the border town. Maisie rummaged through her bag, searching for the letters. They had all entrusted Maisie to deliver them to Tilly, including one from Prince Roland. Ashes took out half of a muffin and offered a piece to Maisie, but she shook her head and instead stuffed a handful of fish jerky into her mouth, mumbling, she went to play with Molly. With that, Maisie flew out of the courtyard, flapping her wings. Ashes felt that Maisie had grown bigger even more in the past month, both in size and maturity. Tilly smiled and said she felt the same, perhaps because life in the border town was truly wonderful. Returning to the room, Tilly tore open the letter sent by Roland and found that apart from a letter filled with content, the remaining dozen or so pages were actually vivid illustrations, laying out the pages of drawings one by one. The contents were somewhat unbelievable and terrifying. The background depicted a desolate wasteland at dusk, with two monstrous creatures engaged in a fierce battle against a group of witches. The witches were clearly at a disadvantage, as their abilities seemed to have lost their effectiveness. Neither snakes nor fireballs could stop the enemy's advance. By the final drawing, several witches lay lifeless in pools of blood. Tilly anxiously grabbed the letter and quickly skimmed through its contents. Soon, she felt her heart tighten as a recurring word in the letter made her hands tremble slightly: demons. The letter described how Hakura obtained an ancient book and led the witches across the Desolation Mountains in search of the Holy Mountain. However, they did not find the Holy Mountain but encountered terrifying monsters instead. These creatures possessed astonishing strength, swift movements, and the ability to command demonic beasts. One of them could even release lightning from its hands. After contemplating for a while and finding no answers, Tilly decided to set aside all of those things and took out Sylvie's letter. She intended to know the results of investigating the Lord of the border town. However, the first sentence of the letter left her stunned, even more so than when she had seen the word demons. Lady Tilly, I have found no traces of disguise or magical influence on Roland Wimbledon. Apart from the Witch Union, there are no other factions of witches hidden in the town. So, I believe, he might be your true brother. Tilly was left speechless, shocked by the revelation in Sylvie's letter. A real brother. How could that be possible? Tilly held the letter in her hands, but her mind couldn't focus. Thoughts swirled in her head like a tidal wave. Among the 5 children of Wimbledon III, the eldest 3 were born close in age and played together. By the time Roland was born, the youngest, Garcia, was already 6 years old, and naturally, they didn't include him in their group. Logically, Tilly should have formed another circle with Roland, but it wasn't the case in reality. Roland longed to be accepted by his 2 older brothers, striving to fit into their circle, but often ended up being the one who was getting bullied. This twisted and volatile treatment caused Roland's character to become distorted and easily angered. Of course, he didn't dare to direct his anger towards the 3 elder siblings, so started bullying Tilly. Ever since Tilly fought back, Roland hadn't provoked her again, and Tilly had chosen to ignore her brother. Even in adulthood, Roland had shown no signs of change. In fact, he had worsened over time. She couldn't believe it. How could someone like him stand with the witches, sheltering them, and even dare to oppose the church? Tilly was perplexed and conflicted. It seemed contradictory to her that someone with Roland's history of bullying and twisted character could now align himself with the very beings he had once despised. The fact that he was willing to go against the church, an institution that held immense power and influence, further intensified her confusion and disbelief. Tilly didn't know what to say for a moment. Ashes nudged her several times before Tilly mentioned that the letter stated that Roland hadn't been controlled or replaced by the witches. When she mentioned the incident with the butt grabbing, Ashes coughed a couple of times. After contemplating for a moment, she remarked that even though they hadn't seen him for just a year, he seemed like a completely different person. Tilly asked Ashes to elaborate further. Ashes thought for a moment and said, "Roland feels clean. Although he doesn't have a preference for extravagant jewelry or clothing like nobles do, his attire is very clean. Overall, Roland now gave a favorable impression." Tilly smiled, surprised that Ashes would speak well of him. She let out a sigh of relief, realizing that her brother had indeed undergone significant changes. But what had prompted his transformation? Perhaps the true reason could only be discovered by meeting him in person. Regaining her focus, Tilly shifted her attention back to the letter. The second half of the letter detailed Sylvie's observations and experiences in the border town, including her daily work and discoveries. As Tilly continued reading, another piece of information caught her attention. It described a weapon capable of launching iron balls and crossbow bolts from iron tubes, with immense power. Although Maisie and Ashes had mentioned such a weapon before, this was the first time Tilly had encountered such a detailed description, complete with hand-drawn illustrations. Ashes suggested that Tilly ask Roland to send a batch of those weapons in her reply. However, Tilly shook her head, explaining that allies should not be approached with suspicion. Such a test would only undermine the trust they had painstakingly built. Besides, they were planning to visit the border town this winter, and it would be better to discuss it in person. Ashes shrugged in response, and Tilly smiled, continuing to read the letter. As her eyes reached the end of the letter, Tilly couldn't help but freeze. Roland had actually invented a type of undergarment designed for women's boing-boings and had gifted it to every adult female member of the Witch Union as a present? It was simply absurd. Wait a minute, Tilly suddenly remembered that when Roland was in the capital, he had also given some noble ladies tight-fitting corsets. Some of them had even been thrown back at his face. This was wildly spread among the nobles. This was definitely something he would do. Tilly felt conflicted. On one hand, it aligned with her memories of him, but on the other hand, she felt that it would be better if he didn't align with those memories. Should she go to the border town to see him this winter or not? Upon returning to the border town, as soon as they entered, Kyle mentioned that he had come up with a feasible plan for large-scale production of sulfuric acid. However, it required a significant amount of lead and skilled craftsmen, and he hoped to seek the assistance of the witches. Roland asked Kyle to provide him with the detailed plan. Then, Roland gestured for him to sit down and taught him another task. Kyle shook his head repeatedly, stating that he didn't have time recently as large-scale acid production was a challenging endeavor that required his full attention. Roland reassured him, saying that it wouldn't require much time. Seeing Kyle's puzzled expression, Roland requested him to manufacture more soap. Kyle immediately recalled the saponification reaction mentioned in elementary chemistry, which involves the reaction between sodium hydroxide and fats or oils to produce alcohol and salt. It was indeed an unusual feeling to hear standard chemical terms from an alchemist's mouth. Roland nodded in agreement, and Kyle still seemed a bit puzzled. It didn't seem important to him, but the prince emphasized that it was crucial. While soap production itself might not be important, the byproduct of the production process was something Roland urgently needed. Kyle immediately realized it was alcohol, and Roland confirmed that he needed alcohol, or glycerin to be exact, as it was a highly important ingredient. Kyle shrugged and said he would assign it to his apprentices, but he would demonstrate the process in front of a few clever apprentices chosen by him. Meanwhile, Roland shared some news with him, mentioning that a sailboat had arrived at the dock with 50 people on board, and one of them claimed to be an alchemist from Crimson Water City. Before Roland could finish his sentence, Kyle stood up excitedly. It was Charles, and he had truly brought his apprentices to join Kyle. Kyle exclaimed joyfully that Charles was his finest disciple, and he will surely fit for the job. Lightning checked her adventuring gear once again, which she carried with her at all times, including survival tools and weapons. Maisie also checked her own belongings, with piles of food laid out in front of Lightning. Lightning was at a loss for words. They were going on an adventure, not having a barbecue in the wilderness, at least bring a weapon. Maisie pointed at her beak, indicating that her beak was her weapon. Lightning sighed. After all, it was just a one-day trip, and they shouldn't encounter any major dangers. They were preparing to explore the westernmost part of the enchanted forest. Lightning had a little secret that she hadn't told anyone. She no longer dared to explore the forest alone. This was a great shame for an adventurer. However, she couldn't deceive herself. The journey to the stone tower had instilled fear in her towards this deep forest. Just the thought of those terrifying creatures potentially hiding somewhere in the forest made her want to escape as quickly as possible. Thunder had once mentioned to her a method to overcome fear: to gradually approach it, observe it, and understand it. Eventually, she would realize that fear wasn't as dreadful as it seemed. This exploration would be Lightning's attempt. With Maisie accompanying her, she felt a bit more confident. They had chosen a safe route, following the Crimson Water River westward without venturing deep into the forest. With this approach, it was unlikely they would encounter any demons. The two quickly approached the magnificent mountain. They had flown to the westernmost part of the forest, where the dark green expanse ended and the land transitioned back to a lighter shade of green. They arrived at a meadow. But as they ventured further, their line of sight was consumed by a pitch-black color that extended all the way to the base of the mountain. They descended towards the dark land. Soon, they realized it was a ground made up of black stones. Maisie pecked at it after landing and found it to be very hard. Lightning picked up a piece of the black stone and examined it closely, realizing that there were countless such stones scattered all around. She collected a few pieces, intending to show them to His Highness upon their return. Lightning called for Maisie, instructing her not to move, and then put on her wind goggles. In an instant, she accelerated to her maximum speed. After flying for about half an hour, she could faintly see the landscape beyond the mountains. She came to a stop and carefully observed what lay ahead. At the edge of her vision, a layer of reddish-brown mist hung over the peaks of the mountains. Roland sat at his desk, pondering how to launch an air raid on the imperial palace of Capital City. Suddenly, he heard a tapping sound from behind the windows. When he turned around, he saw Lightning clinging to the window, looking panicked, while Maisie perched on top of Lightning's head, pecking at the glass. As Nightingale opened the window, the little girl flew into Roland's arms. He gently stroked Lightning's head and comforted her, asking what had happened. Black stones, cool. A huge snowy mountain, cool. Maisie landed on the desk and flapped her wings, delivering the report. With a serious expression, Lightning spoke up, saying she had seen a demon. Roland's face grew solemn, and he told her not to panic, urging her to take her time and calm down. After a while, Lightning raised her head from Prince Roland's arms. She had initially intended to draw the map of the forest, but instead, she discovered a massive mountain covered by a layer of reddish-brown dense fog. The fog was so thick that it resembled undissolved fresh blood, spreading westward without apparent boundaries. The scene was just like the one depicted in Soraya's drawing. After Roland relayed Lightning's findings to everyone, Scroll suggested further investigation of the area covered by the red fog. They needed to ascertain whether it would cross the mountain range and reach the continent along the coastline. Wendy nodded in agreement. They had to be prepared. As the two oldest witches in the Union, Scroll and Wendy were the backbone in the hearts of many witches. Although the others were still somewhat afraid, no one wanted to sit idly by and do nothing. Roland also leaned towards this proposed course of action. Seeing no objections from the group, the plan was essentially settled. The key now was how to implement it. Anna suggested using hot air balloons for reconnaissance. They could camouflage themselves in the sky, using the clouds as cover, and fly over from the sea. Lightning suggested bringing Sylvie along, and Roland nodded, saying he would go as well. As soon as he spoke, Wendy, Scroll, and Nightingale all simultaneously objected, stating that they couldn't let Roland take such risks. Roland, with a serious tone, responded that it wasn't a reckless act. He believed that the demons did not possess the ability to cross the vast sea and high mountains, otherwise, they would have already spread throughout the four kingdoms. They were gathered in the far west, and perhaps they weren't as terrifying as they seemed. There was another reason he didn't mention, one that made him more experienced than anyone in assessing the development of an alien civilization. If he could witness the demons and their cities with his own eyes, it would greatly help in formulating future development directions and counter-strategies. The witches still hesitated. Roland smiled and said that staying in the hot air balloon would definitely be safe. If there was any danger, he wouldn't have let the witches go in the first place. Seeing that their persuasion was ineffective, Nightingale was the first to change her stance. Roland could go, but he had to take Nightingale with him and couldn't leave her side. As he looked into her earnest eyes, Roland knew he couldn't refuse her. After considering it for a while, he announced that the expedition members would be himself, Anna, Wendy, Soraya, Sylvie, Nightingale, Lightning, and Maisie. They would depart in a week. Besides the necessary food, everyone had to carry a pistol, and during this week, everyone must practice diligently. After making the announcement, Roland finally had the time to examine the black mineral Lightning had brought back. He held it in his hand and waited, feeling a slight jump in his heart. In terms of weight, it was much lighter than ordinary stones, making it unlikely to be a metallic ore. It had a hard and lightweight exterior that reflected a metallic luster, and it was exposed on the surface. Could it be coal? Roland asked Anna to release flames, and under the scorching black fire, the stone quickly turned bright red and translucent. Roland immediately realized that it was high-quality anthracite coal. This unexpected discovery filled him with joy. Coal was not rare in Greycastle and was mainly used for kilns and heating. However, its applications were extremely wide-ranging. Before the prevalence of internal combustion engines, the blazing burning of coal fueled everything of steam power. After coking coal, it could replace charcoal for iron and steel smelting, making it much more environmentally friendly than excessive deforestation. Even in the age of electricity, coal could be used to produce coal gas, hydrogen gas, and asphalt, as well as for power generation. It could be considered an excellent and cost-effective fuel. Holding an open-pit coal mine in his hand was very important. The only question was how to develop it effectively. After thinking for a moment, Roland realized that they needed to construct more steamships and fully develop the mining fields in the area. By increasing the number of steamships, they could transport the mined coal more efficiently and expand their capabilities. This would not only meet the local demand for coal but also provide an opportunity for trade and economic growth. The development of the mining fields would require infrastructure, such as railways and processing facilities, to optimize the extraction and utilization of the coal resources. With this unexpected discovery, Roland saw the potential for significant advancements in their industrial development and energy supply. The coal mine would serve as a valuable resource, contributing to the prosperity and progress of their kingdom. In the palace of Greycastle, there was a loud bang as a copper bowl was turned upside down. This was something newly developed by the Alchemist Association of the capital. If used in larger quantities, its power could tear through armor. Timothy was delighted and rewarded the inventor with 25 gold, instructing him to start mass production of it. After the chief alchemist left, a knight remarked that while this invention appeared intimidating, it would be impossible to defeat knights with it. It required ignition to activate, and its effective range was only about half a step. Other knights voiced their agreement, and Timothy felt a twinge of anger. If it weren't for Garcia luring away the alchemist responsible for developing this item at the Alchemist Association, he would have already conquered Greycastle. At that moment, footsteps suddenly echoed outside the door. An anxious guard entered the palace hall and knelt down on one knee. He informed Timothy that the militia force sent by Greycastle to the western border seemed to have suffered heavy losses. The defeated soldiers had returned to the capital, and they had brought with them a letter of inquiry from Roland Wimbledon. Now, many people were aware of the situation and what was written on the letter. The letter stated that Timothy's foolish actions, attacking the western border, were a mistake, and he would pay the price for it. Roland declared that he would launch an attack on the capital in the early second month of autumn, and by then, everyone would witness Timothy's shaky hold on the throne. The training location for revolver shooting was arranged in the courtyard of the castle. Including Sylvie, all the witches selected for the reconnaissance team were given a revolver. After spending 2 days familiarizing everyone with the proper shooting stance, Roland proceeded to the live ammunition shooting phase of the training. The witches performed decently during the gun handling exercises, but the shooting exercise didn't go as expected. Especially when the deafening sound of gunfire echoed and the recoil, everyone's first instinct was to cover their ears, leaving Roland with a vacant expression. He then shifted his gaze towards Anna. There, she held the gun in both hands without moving a muscle, continuously pushing the trigger, completely disregarding the recoil and gunpowder smoke. Setting aside accuracy for a moment, just this action alone was executed perfectly. Roland was secretly amazed. Even though it was a large-caliber revolver, which had a strong recoil, how could her arms remain motionless during continuous shooting? Curiosity drove him to approach her from behind, and he saw that 2 clusters of black flames were tightly adhering to the grip, firmly holding it in the air, while Anna merely made a gesture of grasping, not even touching the handgun. Roland could only laugh wryly and loudly declare, "No one is allowed to use their abilities to assist in practice. If they were to encounter enemies with God's punishment stones, they will be in a frenzy." Seeing a group of witches enthusiastically manipulating their weapons, Roland couldn't help but feel deeply moved. Until now, he still remembered the appearance of each witch when he first met them. Anna used to be as thin as a bamboo pole, with lifeless eyes and a perpetually expressionless face. Nightingale always had a trace of gloom between her eyebrows, and her smile had nothing to do with her emotions. It was, in fact, a mask to conceal her own feelings, always wearing a mischievous smile on her lips. And Wendy, who couldn't hide her fatigue behind her gentle voice. Lily, who had accepted her fate and confusion when she threw herself into the future like a solitary leaf, always on guard like a cat. Surviving after oppression, betrayal, and pursuit was a stroke of luck. There was no time to think about where they were heading. But now, they were completely different from the past. The witches exuded a unique charm, their eyes sparkling with vitality. The future was no longer uncertain for them. Besides simply staying alive, they now had the strength to pursue other things, beautiful things that were just as precious as life itself. In the afternoon, it was time for the specially designed high-altitude throwing exercise. The number of witches participating in the drill was reduced by more than half, leaving only Anna, Wendy, and Lightning. In order to fulfill his promise, Roland planned to drop a 250-kilogram bomb directly above the Grey Castle Royal Palace. As the altitude increased, the border town quickly shrank to the size of a fingernail, and the Crimson Water River turned into a gleaming silver ribbon. However, the drop distance of over 1,000 meters meant that hitting the target will be unlikely. To achieve precise targeting, the bomb had to be equipped with a guidance system. And the young girl, Lightning, would be responsible for this task. "Drop the bomb," Roland ordered. Wendy pulled the valve and released the bomb. Anna sealed the release hole with the prepared cover plate and tightened the fixing bracket. These procedures had been practiced repeatedly on land, and the two of them worked together seamlessly. During the descent of the bomb, Lightning fell at the same speed and applied horizontal thrust to it, allowing the bomb to freely change its trajectory, transforming it into a guided missile. When it was close to the target, Lightning pulled the rear mechanism, separating the deceleration parachute from the bomb. The bomb would gain sufficient kinetic energy in the final few hundred meters and penetrate through the roof of the palace. In this way, the substantial drop distance became a guarantee for precise control of the impact point. The remaining task was to continue practicing this process. A week quickly passed, and Roland called Barav, Carter, and Axe to the castle to inform them that he would be leaving the town for 2 days. He instructed them to continue implementing the town's affairs according to the usual plans. However, his words were met with unanimous opposition from the three. Carter hoped to fulfill his duty as the chief knight and guard the prince. Axe requested to form a 100-person squad for protection. Barav argued that according to the municipal government's decree, any order must be reviewed and stamped by the Lord before it could take effect, urging Roland to stay in the castle. Finally, Roland demanded that everyone follow his command. Barav still didn't understand why Roland had to personally take action. After a moment of silence, Roland spoke up, mentioning that it might be about the survival of the Western Territory or even the entire kingdom. When the three asked for specific reasons, Roland shook his head. He reiterated that this trip was a confidential operation and they were not to disclose the information to anyone. In his mind, Roland considered that the headquarters of the demons might be stationed over 200 kilometers away from the Western Territory, and these demons had once destroyed the holy city of Takira. Revealing such information would be too shocking. As a person who had seen countless doomsday movies, Roland isn't too shocked, but for them, accepting such a reality would be difficult. If the news were to leak, it would cause even more trouble. If it triggered panic among the people, it could lead to a mass exodus from the Western Territory. Therefore, it was not the appropriate time to announce. After attending to the municipal matters, Roland and the witches boarded a hot air balloon and ascended from the castle courtyard, flying towards the direction of the mountains. Since learning about the existence of demons, Sylvie had been burdened with heavy thoughts. She wanted to know if the church, which had fought against the demons 400 years ago, was truly good or bad. Before Roland could speak, Nightingale preemptively responded, stating that the church was definitely bad. Kind-hearted people wouldn't arbitrarily hunt down witches. However, Sylvie continued to stare directly at Roland, as if wanting to hear his answer. Roland contemplated for a moment and said that it was still uncertain whether the church was truly fighting against the demons. If they had made such significant sacrifices, why would they conceal the information and destroy all past records? Spreading this matter widely would be the best way to expand their followers. They still didn't have a complete understanding of many pieces of information, and the distinction between good and bad wasn't so simple. Roland was well aware that Sylvie was actually asking whether he would stand with the church in order to fight against the demons. Sylvie opened her mouth, but didn't deny anything. Roland spoke seriously, stating that the authority of the church and the monarchy were inherently incompatible. Even without the witches, he would not stand on the side of the church. Moreover, now he had everyone by his side. Nightingale smiled proudly. The other witches also expressed their trust in Roland, saying that he was reliable. Sylvie nodded gently, and the heaviness between her eyebrows seemed to fade slightly. And so, as dusk descended, the group could vaguely see the outline of the snow-capped mountains. They selected a camping site on a mountain ridge closer to the sea, allowing them to easily observe their surroundings. It was also far away from the forest, ensuring that wild beasts couldn't easily approach the camp. Everyone began setting up their tents, but due to the limited payload capacity of the hot air balloon, they could only bring one large tent. Therefore, Roland displayed a gentleman's spirit and let the witches sleep in the tent while he slept in the basket. Although Wendy and Soraya suggested that they should go to the basket and let Prince Roland sleep in the tent, he refused each one of them. Only Sylvie kept looking at Roland with a vigilant gaze which left him feeling both amused and exasperated. After assigning the night watch, everyone entered the tent. It was at this moment that faint footsteps could be heard from behind. Roland turned around and found that the person approaching was none other than Anna. Anna approached to accompany Roland. She mentioned that although Sylvie didn't express her gratitude, her mood had become much lighter. Anna herself was also pleased with her own choice. She kissed Roland on the cheek and then went back to sleep. Watching her return to the tent, Roland stretched contentedly and yawned. He intended to go back to the basket to sleep. However, as he was about to do so, an invisible pair of hands cupped his face. There was nothing in front of him, yet he could feel the soft touch on his face once again, but this time, it was from the other side. In the early morning hours, everyone packed up their camping gear and set off once again. Roland also noticed a detail: even when sleeping in the wilderness, the witches' appearances remained flawless, while he clearly couldn't achieve the same. Without looking in a mirror, he could guess that his hair was definitely a mess, and in the eyes of everyone, he probably looked disheveled. After half an hour, following Lightning's instructions, they arrived at the designated location. As Lightning had described, a red mist shrouded the area behind the mountains. The mist pressed down heavily, and the closer they got to the ground, the more intense the red it became. Sylvie couldn't see much due to the distance. As the hot air balloon slowly approached the ground, Sylvie finally began to report what she saw. About 10 miles from the seaside, she had discovered a collection of buildings made of black stones, forming a triangular shape resembling spires. Most of the spires were empty, but some appeared to be filled with liquid. Sylvie froze for a moment. She saw hundreds of pairs of eyes suddenly opened. Sylvie shouted, "The demons have spotted us!" Upon hearing this, Roland gave the order, "Wendy, retreat at full speed." Strong winds quickly blew, and the sudden movement of the hot air balloon caused the basket to tilt. However, Sylvie's warning chilled everyone's hearts. 2 demons were flying towards them on their mounts. These creatures could fly, and it didn't take long for Roland to spot 2 black dots in his field of vision. Looking through his telescope, he saw the mounts beneath them with their sharp-toothed beaks, hairless bodies that bore no resemblance to birds. If he wasn't mistaken, these were 2 hybrid demonic beasts. Roland realized his carelessness. He hadn't expected the demons to have flying mounts, and the situation with lightning was dire. She wouldn't be able to engage in combat like this. If they were shot down from this height, they would undoubtedly meet their demise. The demons were getting closer to the hot air balloon, and Roland could already see the 2 demons approaching. One demon raised its spear. Just as Sylvie issued a warning, Anna had already extended her hands, controlling the black flames to unfold into a thin curtain, shielding the basket. She successfully blocked the incoming attack. The previous block had consumed a considerable amount of her magic. The 2 demons surrounded the hot air balloon from the left and right, and Anna alone defended against one of them. The other witches immediately picked up their pistols and started counterattacking. The witches quickly drew their pistols and retaliated. However, with the basket constantly swaying, it was nearly impossible to hit a fast-moving enemy. After 2 rounds of bullets, none hit their targets. At that moment, the arms of the demons raised once again, and this time, they chose to attack from both sides. Anna didn't even have time to observe the enemy behind her when she summoned a thin layer of black flames to shield the basket. She could only cover one side, and Roland clearly saw the demon swing its right arm towards Anna, but he couldn't see the trajectory of the spear. Almost instinctively, he pushed Anna away, who was facing away from him. Then his shoulder felt as if it had been struck by a heavy hammer, and he was sent flying backward, colliding with the basket wall. An unbearable pain seemed to tear him apart, followed by a strong dizziness, as if his consciousness was slipping away. Nightingale's heart-wrenching cry was the last sound he heard before losing consciousness. Witnessing Roland being hit, Nightingale felt her chest tighten suddenly. She feared that he would never wake up again. Just the thought of it made it difficult for Nightingale to breathe. She had never felt so helpless before. But it was Anna who first reacted. She crouched down, covering the entire wound with a mass of black flames. Under the flames, white smoke billowed, accompanied by a sizzling sound. When the black flames dissipated, Roland's severed arm was charred black. The trickling blood had stopped. It was an emergency measure Roland had taught everyone in first aid classes. They learned to secure the wound, then quickly go to the medical center and find Manhwa. They had to get back as soon as possible. Nightingale turned her head slowly towards the southeast, where the town located. She urgently shouted to let lightning protect the balloon's descent. Although the girl's face was pale, she nodded, casting a glance at the unconscious Roland, and then flew out of the basket. The other demon was still attacking the hot air balloon. Nightingale took a deep breath, forcing herself to temporarily set aside the image of Prince Roland being injured. Now only she could fight the demons. Nightingale saw the best opportunity. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and, taking advantage of the hot air balloon, positioned herself directly on top. The demon was charging straight at them at that moment. Nightingale was surprised to discover that there was a vortex of magic energy slowly rotating within the demon's body, and a shining stone embedded in its arm. Just as the demon was about to collide with the hot air balloon, Nightingale leaped out of the mist and appeared behind the demon. The monstrous winged demonic beast suddenly sank under the increased weight on its back. The demon seemed to realize something and abruptly turned around. But it was greeted by the thunderous roar of a 12mm caliber revolver. The bullet tore through the shroud of flames and smoke and blasted a fist-sized hole in the demon's head. Sticky blood splattered everywhere, and a pungent smell of blood filled the air. The enemies convulsed and fell to the ground, while the demonic beast changed its direction, gliding past the hot air balloon from the side. Just as Nightingale was about to turn back towards the top of the balloon, an unexpected incident occurred. The tilting corpse pulled on the reins, causing the mount to suddenly roll to the side, throwing her off. Before she could react, she had already been thrown beyond a safe distance to return on her own. She heard her sisters shouting in panic, but it was all in vain. Lightning was engaged in a battle with the demons, and even if Maisie transformed into an eagle, she couldn't lift herself up. Nightingale was well aware of the imminent outcome she was about to face. Wendy struggled to control the wind direction but was powerless to stop it. Nightingale closed her eyes, and the scene of her encounter with Roland replayed in her mind. She sat on the edge of the bed, toying with the dagger in her hand, waiting for the prince to enter through the door. Everything started to fade away, leaving only the smiling face of the prince. Nightingale had only one regret, perhaps, was that she couldn't accompany him until the end. Suddenly, a series of high-pitched chirps reached her ears. Nightingale opened her eyes and saw a white figure diving straight towards her, landing on her chest. It was Maisie. She was about to say something when a dazzling white light burst forth from the bird's body. Its form instantly expanded, revealing enormous and formidable flesh wings unfurling from its back. Feathers scattered, and the bird's head transformed into a terrifying and fearsome visage, resembling a flying demonic beast. Maisie let out a deafening roar as her claws grabbed Nightingale and threw her upwards. When Maisie carried Nightingale into the battle, the situation instantly reversed. The demons let out an angry roar and was forced to abandon the pursuit of lightning. Instead, it fiercely hurled a spear towards Maisie. Nightingale tapped Maisie twice, and Maisie's body rapidly shrank, transforming back into a bird. The spear whistled past them, plunging into the sea. In the next instant, Nightingale emerged from the mist and returned to Maisie's back, seamlessly evading the attack. Just as they were about to collide, Maisie suddenly descended, brushing past the enemy's shoulder. Once she regained her balance, Nightingale had disappeared from Maisie's back. She reappeared behind the demons like a phantom. With anger in her eyes, she pulled the trigger, and the gunshots resounded continuously. The demon fell into the ocean. The demonic beast, now without its master, was also struck down by lightning with her pistol, falling into the sea and quickly disappearing. A hot air balloon descended slowly. Everyone anxiously looked at Roland. Wendy mentioned that they had been delayed for so long, and the hot air balloon would take a while to reach the town. They now had to proceed with Lightning and Maisie leading the way for His Highness. Maisie's enormous head opened its jaws wide, reassuring everyone that she was fine. Lightning seemed a bit downcast, probably feeling that as an adventurer, she was afraid of fighting the enemy, which led them all into this predicament. She quietly said she was fine as well. Before setting off, Nightingale gently patted her head, telling her that it wasn't her fault. The witches had bound the unconscious prince to Maisie's back, while Lightning carried the severed hand. The two quickly took off, soaring along the Crimson Water River towards the town. The other witches realized that they needed to leave as soon as possible. The hot air balloon ascended once again, and now only 5 people remained. Soraya was puzzled, wondering why the hot air balloon was spotted, while having sky camouflage and should be difficult to distinguish at a height of 2 kilometers. Sylvie furrowed her brow and explained that there was a gigantic demon with a head even larger than its body, covered in countless eyes. Anna recalled the strangeness of the 2 flying mounts. Their blood was a deep blue color instead of the dark black color from the typical hybrid demonic beasts. Wendy exclaimed how fortunate it was that Maisie could transform into their likeness. If it wasn't for her saving Nightingale, they would all have been in danger. Nightingale, who had been silent all along, suddenly spoke up. she revealed that Maisie abilities had evolved. The magical energy within her was no longer a swirling vortex but had transformed into a fixed form, a pair of unfurled white wings, expanding gracefully. Lightning held onto the arm of His Highness, feeling overwhelming guilt. The demons may have had a fearsome appearance, but it wasn't overwhelmingly powerful in the air. If she had left the hot air balloon from the beginning to intercept the enemy, His Highness wouldn't have suffered such severe injuries. It was at that moment that Lightning realized how far she still was from being an outstanding adventurer. His Highness's breathing grew weaker, and his body grew colder. They had to move at full speed. By the time they reached the border town, Lightning felt dizzy and disoriented. The excessive speed not only drained her magical energy rapidly but also put a tremendous strain on her body. She gritted her teeth and, using her last ounce of strength, landed directly in front of the castle's courtyard. She shouted towards Carter, who had rushed over with a gun upon hearing the commotion, quickly summoned Miss Manhwa. "The prince is injured.